right, so you're listening to NYC Radio Live. I'm with Derek Gripper here in Lenny Stern Studio in the East Village, historic musical place. He just played an amazing concert for Robert Browning Associates. Pretty incredible. And I don't know, you got the guitar in your hand. Do you feel like playing before we chat, or you want to just...
Yeah, we could play.
Sure, yeah, go for it. So you kind of you discovered some new stuff with the instrument. What I guess you started as a classical musician, I take it, and then what happened?
So I started as a classical violinist, and then I learned bass guitar to play in bands and things like that. But I started playing classical guitar, in the middle of my teenage years, and that challenge of learning it was really an interesting challenge. I really enjoyed it a lot. But once I kind of woke up and started paying attention to the music, then I realized I didn't really like the music so much.
Yeah, I kind of had the same issue. I learned classical guitar because I was a wedding DJ, and I thought, I can make more money as to play the ceremonies, and which made me the most dedicated wedding DJ in history, because it was like 4 hours a day, for a couple years. But I was looking for material that like grooved, and I thought, like Villa-Lobos, he's from Brazil, like this'll groove, but I didn't find it. I mean,
it doesn't groove. No, I was really searching the world for two things. One, for like this kind of guru teacher who would be sort of all-knowing and, fabulous, and really be connected to the real source of music, And for that, I went to India to study, Indian classical music. Then I gave up on music and I went to India to study yoga. I thought, okay, maybe the yogis are going to be like really, because I was kind of encountering professionals, who were teaching at universities, or had this kind of, and I was really looking for this, the idea we have of music after when you're 19 and you've read Siddhartha or something, But I couldn't find any music that grooved. Villa-Lobos, you try, and it kind of, and you persuade yourself that some of it works, and Bach was definitely something that had something, but then you kind of step away from the technical challenge of playing, and you're like, but this isn't still not really the music that I would put on a record player if I wanted to listen to music. I wasn't listening to this music. I was listening to Keith Jarrett and stuff, I don't know. And then I discovered Egberto Gismonti, and he was playing nylon string guitar, and it rocked. It was like amazing, and he was playing dirty, and he was grooving. And so that's when I woke up and realized, okay, you could do something with guitar, but...
Right, yeah. No, okay. It seems like we followed the same path and made the same mistakes about the guys with the flowing robes and all this stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
You must have it all figured out. You're wearing saffron.
Exactly. You're looking great.
So, all right. So you discover the Egberto Gismonti, and then when did you start finding your own path? Because I mean, you found something with African grooves.
Well, I had like these two, like the left shoulder and the right shoulder was Egberto Gismonti on the one side, and this guy called Paul Galbraith on the other, who was playing 8-string guitar. And so Paul was playing in this pristine, incredible architecture of classical music. He was making it feel like the guitar could be a great classical instrument, and that you could, really sort of play the ideals of classical music. But then on the other side, you had Gismonti, who was just reaching into the bowels of the instrument, and so I was oscillating between these two extremes, and playing really strict classical, and then trying to write music like Gismonti. And it took a long time until about 2010 when I decided, hey, why don't I actually try and play Gismonti's music? I hadn't really thought of doing that because he plays 10-string guitar and the scores don't exist. So I started transcribing his music for guitar, and I made an album called The Sound of Water, where I put some of my compositions alongside his, and I was playing pieces. A lot of people play his music, but they play his piano music. The guitarists transcribe forever and all these things. So I was playing his actual guitar music and transcribing it onto guitar, which not very many people do. So that was the beginning of the idea of transcribing from recordings. At the same time as listening to Gismonti and Paul Galbraith on classical guitar, I discovered this album by Toumani called Kaira, Toumani Diabate, the kora player from Mali. So there you hear the groove, but you've got the counterpoint of Bach all together in one thing. But it's completely impossible that could be played on guitar because there's this polyrhythms, and he's keeping a bass line the whole time because it's a harp. And so I thought maybe if I invented some kind of multi-string guitar, then I could have the bass line going on kind of a harp and then be able to improvise on the top, because I didn't understand the music. But about 2011, I had a brainwave, and I slowed down the recording. And then I was, oh my gosh, this is what he's doing. I could suddenly hear what he was doing. And then I started retuning the guitar until I found a tuning that worked, and then transcribing it very painstakingly onto the page. And that's what became the record One Night on Earth.
All right, so yeah, there was, I guess, a bunch of techniques that you must have kind of discovered along the way. I wonder if you could demonstrate some of them. I mean, one is just like those amazing runs that the kora does.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I did was playing like them. So playing like the kora when I played Bach or when I played my own compositions. So, bringing out these little stops. Things and little trills, and so I started developing that. But the tuning came out of the transcribing. So this became the tuning that works for all kora music, which is D-A-D, like the drop D of classical guitar, and then the F sharp of Renaissance lute, like that Vihuela music, and we put the two together, D-A-D, F sharp, B-E. Got a capo on the 3rd fret now, so it's different. That gives you the basic, all the chords that you really need for the kora music. So the first piece I did was Tubaka.
Wow, that stuff is heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece. It's totally crazy. No, it was really exciting to be able to hear it on guitar and play it on guitar and finally be playing the music that I would actually put on a record myself, that I would want to listen to. That was really amazing. And that was a breakthrough because that hadn't been the case before. I wasn't sort of putting on a Villa-Lobos record in the afternoon, and then practicing it the next day. So this was the first time that listening integrated with the playing.
And interestingly, I mean, nylon string guitar is not so far from the fishing line of a kora.
No. And what's crazy was that, Toumani would do things like you'd have a line that went up high and you couldn't get to the bass note, and he'd have an open string in that one place. There'd be an open string there. You'd be like, wow, if that hadn't been an open string, I wouldn't have been able to play it. So it felt like he'd really planned out everything so that it could be played on guitar, because it's perfect. It just falls straight onto. Once you have this tuning, everything on the kora just falls straight onto the instrument. There's really literally nothing you can't play on the guitar.
And what are some of the varieties of grooves that you discovered? I mean, this kind of has that what else did you come across in these transcriptions?
Well, I mean, there's things like this one, which so that Jarabi has the 3-3-2, which I don't think that's how most griots would think of it. But that rhythm. Then you got something like this one.
Yeah, it's stunning. And I've had these fun. We were talking before how I have my own history studying with griots, and I remember that change in feel. I can remember exactly them, Fomoro Jabate, looking me in the eye as he switched the feel to that, and the implication being like, you don't know anything about music.
Yeah, and I mean, the first time I heard that was in a recording by Nadaka and Ganesh. He's a guitarist from France, lives in Oroville, and Ganesh is a Carnatic violinist. And at some point, there's a percussion solo which I later heard was played by Viku Vinayakram's son, Salva Ganesh, and he's playing and he's in the groove, and then suddenly it goes into like another gear and changes, and that was like one of the most exciting things I've ever heard in music. It's like, oh my God, you can do that! It's amazing.
Wow, Salva Ganesh is in town, by the way, just so you know.
No way.
Yeah.
I studied in 2001, 2000. I spent 6 months in Chennai studying with his family.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay, small world. Yeah, I was with Swaminathan yesterday. Yeah. Cool. Wow. So, all right. So you discovered all this kind of stuff, and now you probably just felt like you kind of like arrived as a musician. Like you found something new that was lacking in the repertoire of classical guitar.
Well, the first step was to try and my first thing was I wanted to present the idea that they were great African composers, and Bach would have been going into the studio to put his ideas down if there'd been electricity. So Toumani going into a studio and Bach writing something down, I see as very similar activities, very different from a modern composer who's sitting in Sibelius or writing on a page, and then giving it to musicians. I see written music in early European music as a much more sense of recording than planning. The music existed in their fingers, in their ears, and they could write it down. Just like Toumani's music exists in his fingers and his ears. He's not having a conceptual idea. Like, wouldn't it be interesting to take all 12 tones and hear them all once, and then, there's not that kind of thing. The idea of the composer, I don't think, had happened on such a level, in early music. So that was the first thing, is to actually say, okay, I want to play not Jarabi, which is a traditional griot piece, but I want to play Toumani's composition, which is based on Jarabi, just like I play Bach's composition, which is the chaconne, based on a dance that's everybody played. It's recognizable to anyone. Oh, that's a chaconne. But there's a Bach one, which everyone plays and likes. So I wanted to present that idea first. Unfortunately, what happened is that I finally went to Bamako to play with Tumani in 2016. And having played this music a lot, it's not a music that you want to just play the same time every time you play it. It's kind of a modular improvisation at the simplest, and then more can happen. And then when I was in Bamako and I listened to a guy called Jelly Philly Sako play Jarabi, which I'd been playing for years by that time, and he played it for about 45 minutes, and every moment was different, but recognizable. So it was like listening to somebody play a Bach piece that you knew well, but just do whatever he wanted with it. So that introduced a new layer of what a classical musician could do when he's interpreting music. Because now we're slaves to the text, and we think all the answers lie in the text or in the composer or in the teacher, and we're very scared to do our own thing, because there's all this pressure from around us. So in West Africa, they don't have that fear at all. They do whatever they want. But the musicians that I've heard, they play with the piece, and that's why they're accepting of what I do, which I was worried about. Are they going to accept? Am I playing the rhythm wrong? Am I tapping in the wrong place? But that's not how people think about music there. So there's this sense of improvisation, and interpretation is really like linked to improvisation. So that happened. So the pieces became even more loose, and now I'm back to where I was before, which is improvising and composing, but of course with this in my... So I've just made a record called 25 Minutes in North Vancouver, which is a 25-minute unedited improvisation. And you can hear, the Gismonti, you can hear the Tumani and that in it, but I'm not actually quoting from anything of either of them.
Yeah, it's interesting. They say like Saraband was like a Congolese dance, the Zarabanda. And I've heard other musicians say that Baroque music in general was really influenced by West African music, and they say they can hear it. I don't hear it as much, but
Wow.
that there's so much going on. So it could be a whole thing.
I hear like the Bach phrases. You have something like the violin partita. That would be one way of playing it, because you can see each discrete note on the page, so you have a concept of I need to articulate each of those notes. That you want to make that really clear. Whereas a griot would never play like that. They'd be... interested in how would we phrase the music if we weren't reading it, if we were hearing it as words and phrases, and and this kind of metricality that's come definitely in classical guitar especially, but you hear it in all classical music now.
Yeah, apparently Bach was a ferocious improviser, and there's a great book called The Pianists, and it's contemporary people from that time, kind of their own diaries, who are like around Liszt or these people, and you get these incredible stories about what a rock star, say Liszt was, or something like that, and amazing stories of Bach just destroying a foe in a salon, just cutting them, with the strings breaking off of the pianos, and just killing it. And also, they said that he was not they were not super tied to the metronome like music is now.
Yeah, well, they tried to invent a metronome at one point, and but it's impossible. You couldn't make a mechanical device that could give the musicians the pulse that they need, because the pulse is never the same. It's always changing. And so it was kind of considered an impossibility. And that's I don't know if you know William Kentridge, a wonderful South African artist, does a lot of things at the Met, the operas and that. But he had a piece called The Refusal of Time, when he talks about what happened in Europe when they centralized and mechanized time. and for the first time you have this idea of time being referred back to one place, and everybody is an hour or two or three before or after. And this was a huge idea, that hadn't existed. And the same in tuning and temperament, the idea of being able to tune instruments the same in every country, the A being 440, and then the intervals being able to be mechanically divided into exactly 12. They had this idea of equal temperament, but they could only do it in the early 20th century because they only had the technology. I think they did a study where they looked at all the main piano tuners of London, and they were all doing so-called equal temperament completely differently. And if you go back 200 years, everyone was tuning their instruments differently. You go to Zimbabwe and you say, how is the mbira tuned? It's like, well, how is it tuned? It depends on the musician. And the kora was like that. If you listen to early kora recordings, you can almost hear who the different players are because they have very individual tunings. Whereas now, you go to Bamako and everybody has a guitar tuner stuck to the neck of their kora, and they're tuning in equal temperament. So just these small changes, and then everybody hearing Tumani's recordings, and so they start to play Jarabi all like Tumani plays it because that's the popular way, whereas before that, every region would play it differently. And if you went to Gambia, there'd be one style of kora playing. I mean, even if you listen to Sidiki Diabate, Tumani's father, and Amadou Bansang Jabate, and they were separated for 20 years. They didn't see each other. The one was in the Gambia, and Sidiki had moved to Mali. Their playing styles are completely different, because they 20 years change, So all of these things, and now we're 200-300 years after Bach, and we're trying to reimagine how he played. It's such a beautiful, wonderful thing to think about because we actually have no idea. It's like trying to work out what Keith Jarrett would sound like, but you've never heard jazz. You've got a photograph of the piano, you've got a transcription of the Kong concert, and you've got some reviews of his concerts and like the fact that he used to hum along and like do these weird contortions with his body, and you kind of try and work out what it sounded like, and rebuild the piano from some pictures, from an oil painting,
Right. And so this approach that you've stumbled upon for yourself, like you by improvising, you're in the land of no mistakes, right? So that kind of gives a lot more life and to your own experience making the music.
Well, we got excited in the 80s about different cultures, and maybe just before as well. Ravi Shankar came to the West and introduced people to Indian music, and then there was this big explosion of world music and African music, and so it was very interesting to hear people who'd been cut off from dominant Western culture and had learned music in a different way, and that was really fascinating. Whereas now we know that we all have phones, we're all watching YouTube, we all, grew up, Tumani's children grew up watching MTV and playing the kora to pop videos, so that's changed. So I find what's interesting is, where is the human element that comes out of a particular music? And what I find in the griots is that there's a connection to the body in a really natural way still, because of the way they learn music and because of the way they think about music. So you go and you see some 7-year-old having his first kora lesson, and it's the most natural thing in the world, and he grooves like hell, and he plays a syncopation that like most university students wouldn't be able to do because it's in his body and he doesn't know that it's difficult, and it just happens naturally. And if you think of English, imagine we learned English in the way we learn music, we wouldn't be able to speak after 2 generations. If we intervened in the process of language acquisition and started having half-an-hour lessons every 2 days in a locked room with a teacher, it would be a complete fucking disaster. So I'm more interested in that, and that's why I'm more interested in individuals than I'm interested in musical cultures. Like, I'm not particularly interested in Malian music as such. I'm interested in certain Malian musicians who really connect to that, just as I would be interested in Indian musicians who connect to that, and classical musicians who have that ability to sort of transcend the ideas about music and their body. You can see, and Bach would have totally been that, by the descriptions.
Yeah. So you well, just an aside, because it ran through my head. We actually we had wars like in this country, but when they instituted the the time thing when the railroads came through and they needed to standardize the times. There were like towns that were like, we're not changing our clock, you bastards. You know,
Yeah.
it was like a whole thing. You know, I guess they didn't win that one.
Well, there's not enough resistance, and I see that in West Africa. There's not enough resistance because there's not enough knowledge. Because classical music, where a lot of this came out of, I mean, I think a lot of what we see in contemporary pop music and rock music, you know, singing in tune, auto tune, all this, which is now massive in West African pop and all that. This all came out of classical music, and classical musicians aren't honest about it. They're not honest about what in tune means. So these West African musicians who come with these incredible, beautiful temperaments, which would rival the temperaments of Bach, and that, you know, they come to Germany to play a concert, and they want to play with a keyboard player, and the keyboard player will say, well, you know, you are out of tune, you know. Or they come to record an album, and the English producer will say, oh, well, we need to tune this kora a bit because it is a bit out of tune, you know. But I mean, equal temperament, every piano is tuned in today, would have been a total abomination to Bach's ears, to that era. And this was something that was fought about, just like the time zones. People fought about it and wrote books about it. There's reams and reams of books until they eventually decided in the Industrial Revolution, when every home had to have a piano, that this was the only way they could do it. But every musician had their own way, and Bach wrote a beautiful diagram, apparently, on his 24 preludes and fugues, which he showed a simple way that teenagers who he was applying for a job to teach teenagers, they could tune the harpsichord in this very simple way, and he showed how. And there they could play in that tuning all 24 keys, and he wrote those 24 preludes and fugues. That's one of the theories. I like the theory, so I'm going to say it's...
We're not restricted to facts. Yeah. No. So you also got into the South African... I'd like to... Maybe you could talk a little about that and demonstrate it.
Yeah, I mean, South African music...
And this was the Khoisan people?
Well, I came to South African music, you know, when I was growing up. South African music was, you didn't, you know, when I'm talking about like what we called boere music, the Afrikaans folk music, you know, that was like, you know, there were two types of music that I was taught to hate. It was country and western music and boere music, you know. It is like that, you did not listen to that. That was absolutely the worst form of terrible. And so I met a guy called Alex van Heerden in the late 90s, and we started playing together. And Alex had started in jazz and started playing in the townships of Port Elizabeth, trumpeter, and then moved to Cape Town at the age of 17, got on a bus actually from Port Elizabeth and joined a band called the Genuines on tour, which was a Cape Town sort of punk band that came out in the 80s and made, you know, this mix of what we call guma, which is the carnival music of Cape Town, and various things. So Alex introduced me to a lot of this music in a positive way for the first time. So it had been in my ears and in my environment, but I'd kind of rejected it. So he played me, you know, Manny Rees, the Afrikaans violinist who played boere music on the violin, and he played me, and we listened to Vastrap, which is the you know, you have this weird thing where there was this racial divide in Afrikaans music and Afrikaans culture, where during the apartheid era they had to decide that they were white Afrikaners and colored Afrikaners. They, you know, which is the middle racial distinction in South Africa. You were white, you were black, or you were colored. And there were three layers in society. So you would have you had three education departments for each of these racial distinctions, you know. So the white people would get proper education, the colored people would be educated enough that they could do, you know, desk jobs, and the black people would be educated enough that they could be told to carry something from here to there and sign their name on a check. And that was the Bantu education system that was in place for many years. And so in order to create the complexity, obviously it wasn't difficult to know who was black and who was white. They had to do a huge thing to get rid of to get the white people out of the menial labor economy where they were, because everyone, you know, the miners in the early 20th century were black and white and everybody. So they had to create this thing to say to the white people, no, you must get out of there, you must, you know, and But what do you do with the middle, which was the Afrikaans-speaking people, who were brown, and maybe a little bit white and maybe a little bit darker? That was the big complication in apartheid, is how to work out who was who. And they separated families. A sister and a brother could be classified differently because of the way that they looked. And that happened inside the music as well, because you had Afrikaans music, which was a mix of these people were creating music and creating the language all together. And that separated into Boere music, which was the serious, white Afrikaans music, and the Vastrap, which was the farm, laborer, colored, mixed race Afrikaans music. And the way that they speak Afrikaans is very different. So Alex was interested in these two extremes of the music and how they linked up, and this as a sort of proof of the fact that this had been more one people before. This had been a culture that had been created together, and I think it's a great way of understanding class in music. That how Bach would have played compared to how the guy down the road playing the dance, the wedding dance, were probably quite similar. And slowly, as this idea of serious music and the concert hall and the empire, then music became more and more serious, and the split between folk and classical music by the time you get to Wagner is so massive. And so now we think if we want to understand Bach, we have to go to a classical conservatory, but probably we'd be better off in the forests of Sweden learning with a Swedish fiddle player to understand how Bach played, or, in my view, in the streets of Bamako playing with the griots, because the way of orally learning music, I think, is closer. So I think we're looking in the wrong place when we try to understand Bach and we go to a conservatory, which is what I initially did. This is a completely modern invention, this way of playing Bach, and it's beautiful, and it's produced Glenn Gould and wonderful things. But I don't think it's very, in the early music movement coming out of that, tried to recreate it, but I think there's some source materials that they overlooked.
Yeah, it's interesting, when you're telling me all this history about apartheid, and it's so strange how when you study music, the history that gets uncovered is not the stuff that they tend to teach you in your high school or whatever. Like, I learned more about American imperialism by just learning about Cuban music and how that all played out, and the sugar plantations and all this stuff. And so like I didn't know about any of this stuff. So yeah, and so then you got into this South African music and figured something out.
Yeah, we started doing things like we had these, and we made a record called Sagtevlei, where we got together on a farm, which the name was Sagtevlei of the farm. It was about 2 hours from Cape Town. This was in 2000, and I got asked by a kind of like the Cape Town equivalent of Afropop. They were starting as an online music magazine, and they started a series called The Wonder Gigs, which was a 1 year at the SABC studios, South African Broadcasting Corporation studios in Cape Town. Beautiful room, 100-seater recording studio. They started doing these monthly concerts and recording them and releasing them as records. And I got asked to do one with string quartet and to make a collaboration. And I said, this is the opportunity to work with Alex, because we'd been talking about working together. So we got together on a farm, and we spent about a week or two together. And every day we spent about 15 or 20 minutes writing music. That's all. And the rest of the time we ran up the mountain, and swam dams, and cooked food and things. And it was a really effortless, amazing process of composition, which I've only experienced once again in my life, and that was when we did it again for another project a few years later. And what we did was Alex would come with a musical idea that came from his sort of oral repository of Cape music, the carnival music, Cape jazz, like something like. That would be something that could be played on trumpet, or in the carnival. Just one phrase that would have been followed by many others, and we'd take just that one phrase, and then I'd bring an idea from contemporary classical music. So for that, we used a phase, like Steve Reich phase, and we had a violin and a viola playing that and then going out of phase. And while that was happening, we had a double bass player who was doing this kind of calabash inspired bass solo, and on top Alex was playing trumpet in the actual Cape style. So you had this Steve Reich phase in the middle, you had this like improvised kind of, you know, West African style double bass underneath, and then on the top this, you know, Alex was like sort of he had the kind of Miles, very muted, beautiful sound, but he was totally immersed in the language of Cape jazz, and in a very beautiful way. Or we'd take another melody and we'd say, right, we're gonna harmonize this in parallel harmonies like Messiaen, you know, but very simple ideas. We'd just take one idea from contemporary Western classical and one kind of thing, or we'd sit together and he'd write a melody, you know, a phrase, and then I'd answer it with a phrase from some other place, and then we'd harmonize them using a Messiaen technique or Stravinsky something, or, you know, and we made this record called Sachteflei, and that was my first actual record. I was playing viola in the string quartet, and it was a really amazing time. And then we got together later. I made a record called Blomdurens, where I brought these ideas together on solo guitar. So, you know, a lot of music in we always used to argue, Alex and I, about, you know, all music in the Western Cape is in the major, and I'm a bit minor. They have this interesting thing like this: the Afrikaners, the white Afrikaners, they'll use this chord, the sixth, right? And if you go into the farms, you'll hear the minor seventh. I mean, no, am I getting it wrong? No, they get, yeah, sorry, I haven't thought about this for a while. They'll use this as the tonic chord, and you often find, you know, so there's little changes, but actually, you know, that's a actual seventh. That's a seventh overtone, which is actually, so they were both on either side of this natural overtone that the instruments couldn't reach, and we found this guy who tuned his guitar like this and played all the chords in these, you know. So we were just playing with a lot of these different things, and that's what happened. I went on a tangent there.
Oh, no, that's fascinating. I haven't heard that album yet. That sounds amazing.
So Blomdurens was like very simple guitar music. The same music that Abdullah Ibrahim was drawing on, you know, the famous Cape jazz. Yeah. That's where Alex was coming from, and then I was taking that back to the guitar and doing it in a very simple way. So that piece, that cyclical round and round of, you know, something with three chords, that comes out of the church music in the Western Cape. They call it the koortjie. You know, this like just trance, you know, making church music into trance music. And then we did another record together with string quartet, but now by this time I was playing guitar, and it was called Spore by die Bek van 'n Eystervat, which translates as footprints at the mouth of an iron pig's hole. The iron pig is a porcupine, and it came from a picture from the Bleek and Lloyd collection, which is an amazing collection of language and poems and drawings of Khoisan people in the late 1800s that was documented by a linguist for over a long period of time, and so we made a string quartet based on that. So that's kind of how I started to make friends with the music of the Western Cape. But it's still, you know, it was where I was, but it wasn't who I was, and it wasn't, you know, we limited ourselves to that region for a long time. And Alex died in a car accident in 2009, 2 weeks after we did a live show. We had a kind of reunion show. We hadn't been playing together for a while, and we had a 10-year reunion of the Sachteflei recording with myself and the double bass player Bryden Bolton, who'd worked with Alex since they were young, and we made a trio performance, and luckily we recorded it. And then Alex died 2 weeks later. So that album, Alex, is also, all these are on my website, derekgripper.com. But we limited ourselves to this idea that we wanted to remain rooted in South African music and people and places and that. And so after that, I did make some solo records still in this kind of vein, but when I started transcribing and playing Gismonti and then again Tumani, I started to incorporate the other things, that were actually a big part of my musical world as well, and that was the kind of liberating moment when I realized I didn't have to be South African in the musical terms.
Right. And I guess, I was just speaking to a bansuri player, a white guy, and he's kind of like, no one wants to hear a white bansuri player.
Yeah.
And so I guess, in the world, there's so much identity politics and stuff like that, and with what people want to see if they go to hear some African music. Like, how does that... Is it different for you because you're playing an acoustic nylon string guitar, or do people say, like why should I go hear this guy? Like, does that go through your head? Like, do you deal with these kind of issues? Like,
well, when I made the One Night on Earth, which is these kora transcriptions, the first question I was asking myself is, are people going to think these are covers? Because if you think in classical music, it's not covers at all. Glenn Gould didn't play covers; he interpreted Bach. It's a very serious and wonderful thing. But if he'd done an album of Beatles tunes, it would have been covers. So are we talking about African music using the language of pop music, or are we using the language of classical music? And I was really trying to say we should be using the language of classical music as well, because it's neither. But how can we see it through the lens of classical music? So that was the beginning of my project, and I put the album out thinking, okay, what's going to happen? And people didn't think, oh, these are second-rate covers. I mean, the first reviewers would say, well, why would I want to listen to this guy play the music when I can listen to Tumani play the music? But I think people have recognized that it's not better or worse or another version. It is another version. It's just another perspective on the music. Just like we want to hear multiple perspectives of a piece of Bach. We want to hear Pablo Casals play the cello suites, and we want to hear Yo-Yo Ma play the cello suites, and we want to hear, that's what's interesting in classical music, is different people's readings. And of course I'm going to play this music different to Tumani because my musical background is completely different and my instrument is completely different. So some people find value in that, and I'm sure there are others who just wouldn't even bother because they're quite happy listening to Tumani. And absolutely, Tumani's an incredible musician, so that's totally fine. But I hope that people can, that we can have this idea that it's actually important to hear multiple readings of things and multiple contexts in things. And so, if I'd been playing Tumani's music on the kora, I don't think I would have had a chance in hell, of anyone wanting to come, and fair enough. We haven't got there yet. But I think we should be getting there, at some point, because there's some, there's no reason why because it's all about love. What do you love? What are you drawn to? It's not about what culture you're born in anymore. It's about when the radio goes on and you hear something and you go, wow, that, and you just go for it, and that's going to have to become the impetus of how we learn music, because no one can say that they're born in a culture and that's the music they knew and therefore that's the music they play. Sorry, it's over.
Right. So any other anything you have your sights set on? Like if you could just press a button and you wouldn't have to go through all the hellish or maybe joyful transcription time. Is there some other kind of something else in the globe that's kind of drawing you right now?
Well, we were speaking before you started recording about Indian classical music, and I've got some shows coming up in London with Debashish Bhattacharya, the Indian slide guitarist, incredible musician. And again, there's a great syncretism. He's playing Indian classical music on a Hawaiian guitar, which has become a totally accepted thing. So when I first went to India and wanted to study the violin at the age of 19, very naively, for 2 months, I thought I could pick up a little bit, and I realized, okay, these guys are serious. They've got violins, and like, I'm not going to be able to even touch this. That's what made me decide I'm going to focus on guitar. And I had this idea. I was listening to Keith Jarrett's solo piano concerts then, the improvised piano concerts, and I had this kind of idea then that, wouldn't it be amazing to be able to do something like what he did on the piano, on the guitar? Wouldn't it be amazing to be able to improvise like that on the guitar, explore multiple tunings in one piece, go for ages? And that's, been the kind of impossibility, something I had to shelve, that's been kind of impossible. And I'm feeling pretty happy. This Vancouver project I just did, this guy asked me to come to his studio to record. I had nothing to record, but I said, hey, yeah, why not? And I arrived, and he had everything set up. So I said, well, just press record. And I played for 25 minutes, and that's what we kept, and that's what we released. And for the first time, I was able to capture an actual long-scale composition, which was made in the moment. And so that's something I would like to explore. It's hard live. I don't know how Keith does it. To go, because he's committed. I suppose people are expecting that now. So he kind of, he can't go quoting the Khan concert. Not that he would. So that's something that I want to really develop. And when I play with Debashish, I realize that there's still so much to learn. From so much music. So I'm just kind of wandering around this huge world of. I'm working on a project of transcribing the songs of Fanta Sako, who's an incredible Malian singer whose music is not very well known, but she would have been one of the influences of Tumani. A lot of the pieces that Tumani play come from the recording that she made in 1971. So I'm transcribing them for solo. I'm looking for a very good singer. That my idea is to have someone singing them in English, translated, because I want to totally recontextualize it. Because we're used to hearing griots singing and experiencing that, but I want that shared humanity of it, where we hear it and go, oh, these people are singing about love, they're singing about death, they're singing about things that it's not just some strange thing. It's like, oh, these griots, and it's 800 years old, and isn't this so I want to get to that shared place, and that's why in a concert I'll play something by Tumani and I'll play something by Bach, because I'm not changing any of the variables. I'm still a white guy with a classical guitar in both. So I've taken away the otherness. For somebody who knows Bach, they can listen to the Bach fugue, and then they can hear the Tumani, and they can go, wow, this is really similar. And it's similar because of the way I'm interpreting both, but it's also similar because it's human music, and there's a lot of similarities, and maybe historical similarities, like you said, I don't know. But there doesn't even need to have been, there's a shared something happening, and that's what I'm trying to emphasize. That these resources are open to us.
For sure. So you want to take us out with a little improvisation?
Wow, pressure.
Or you could go on the editing room floor. Wow. So in like 300 years, some conservatory students is going to have to play the transcription of that.
Shame.
Exactly.
I know. It's terrible. Properly.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't fuck it up, okay?
All right. Great hanging with you. This was fun.
Thank you. Thanks so much.